I'd like to open the afternoon lecture, our college guest lecture series this spring here as part of Enrichment Week, and welcome all of you to this session on a very rainy afternoon amidst threat of tornadoes, which apparently didn't touch down, we hope, in Ball State campus. And I had the very pleasant duty of introducing our speaker, Sharon C. Park, FAIA. Sharon is the Senior Historical Architect for the Heritage Preservation Services Division of the National Park Service in Washington, D.C., and also serves as Chief of the Technical Preservation Services branch within the division. She is responsible for the management of the Federal Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program for the Park Service. All the tax credit applications from all the country go into her office and are reviewed by her staff, 22. Actually, they're not all working on tax credits. She's also responsible for the National Historic Landmarks Assistance Initiative, Historic Landscape Initiative, the Surplus Federal Property Transfer Program of the Park Service, and the educational programs and publications of the Technical Preservation Services. And I should mention that this includes the preservation briefs and tech notes that many of us use. She's a registered architect and has been with the Park Service since 1980. Prior to that time, she worked in private practice, preserving historic buildings as part of the bicentennial of the United States. She is a noted author and speaker at conferences on historic preservation. And referring to the preservation briefs, she's written or edited 12 of the 41 preservation briefs. These are used, as many of you know, by not only architects, but public building administrators, owners, preservationists, SHPO staffs, and many others. As a senior historical architect, she's instrumental in setting the direction within the division for developing policy, providing technical assistance, and integrating federal requirements into historic preservation projects. She is well versed on the issues in historic preservation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, incorporating affordable housing into historic buildings, managing lead hazards in housing, improving energy efficiency in historic buildings, materials conservation, cyclical maintenance, and using the tax credits as a financial tool. Sharon has been active with the American Institute of Architects since 1975, is a member of the College of Fellows, and is an active participant in the AIA's National Historic Resources Committee. Also, she's active with the Northern Virginia AIA Historic Resources Committee, and I might add that Jonathan Spodek, who's with us now, was active in that committee several years back. She is a member of the Association for Preservation Technology International, and by way of education holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree with honors from the Catholic University of America in Washington, and a Master of Arts in American Studies and Historic Preservation from George Washington University. We are honored, Sharon, to have you with us today as a lecturer, and look forward to your presentation, Preservation, What Practitioners Need to Know. Sharon Park.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's always good to get back to see what's happening in architecture school and historic preservation programs. When I went to Catholic University for my 5-year professional degree, there was no historic preservation course. The only thing that we would see periodically would be a Habs Hair summer measuring team flyer on a bulletin board, and we didn't even know what Habs Hair was. We sort of just disregarded it. The major emphasis in architecture school in the 60s was urban planning. It was thought that urban planning was really the future of our urban revitalization, that we could cure all of the social ills with new architecture. I think we had the feeling we were going to go out and save the world, and in fact what we were doing was a lot of demolition of our historic districts. In 1966, when I started in my first year program, was really the landmark legislation, the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act. Any of you who've taken Jim's class or others will know that this established the National Register of Historic Places. It established the system of state historic preservation offices. It established the Advisory Council. It identified that there were going to be standards and guidelines developed to assist with evaluation of historic preservation projects. So what I want to tell you today is a little bit about what we do as practitioners in historic preservation and our thought process, and then also to give you a lecture on the standards and guidelines as they relate to our investment tax credit program. And for any of you who do not know what the tax credit program is, as Jim said, it's sort of the carrot that gets a lot of people to do historic preservation in a way that meets the Secretary's standards. If you rehabilitate a historic building and put it into commercial production, such as a restaurant or a hotel or a law office or whatever, and you derive income from that business, the substantial investment that you have made in rehabilitating that building, 20% of the allowable costs come back to you in the form of a tax credit. So you are forgiven taxes owed to the federal government based on 20% of the amount of money. So for every $1 million that you put into a building, 200,000 is forgiven in taxes. So for large development projects, this is a particularly enticing carrot to have. As preservation practitioners, we think a little bit differently in historic preservation than we do when we're doing just architectural design. So I thought I would go through just a little bit of that and tell you how I think preservationists think a little bit differently from designers and planners. And one is that we start with resources and settings, and it's our job to sort of evaluate and develop what is significant about that property and what level of integrity it has, because this is going to set the foundation for every decision we make from here on that particular resource. So instead of starting with a blank slate, we're starting with an existing building that probably has been identified as individually eligible for the National Register of Historic Places or a contributing building in a structure. Then we need to look at a program of use that has been established for that building and begin to scope it out and see if it can really fit into the envelope of this building. We have to begin the process of design and planning with a lot of levels of oversight onto this project, and we have to identify, design, and specify how we're going to manage retaining historic materials and a historic character. So I think there is a lot of challenge, and many people have asked, so where's the design in historic preservation? And I think the design is the greatest challenge of all. How can you put a new layer onto a historic building and have it function in a new use and still retain those character-defining features? And in the slideshow that I'm going to give you, we'll show how these standards are met. Also, I think preservation is really multidisciplinary. When I was doing my apprenticeship, it was with a firm that did mostly institutional design. All my training was in contemporary design. I feel passionately that what is new should be new and what is old should be old. I don't cotton to having too much replicative design in historic preservation projects for the new work. I feel that design should be compatible but contemporary and identified as a new element on a building. And I think that's a challenge for design as well. We have a team approach. When I started doing preservation work for the bicentennial, I suddenly was out of an office that had very strong design egos and into an office that had a team approach, and I felt really sort of energized by that. We dealt with archaeologists, historians, museum interpreters, archivists, architects, structural engineers who understood construction technology of the early era, and landscape architects who were looking for what was the historic context that these buildings were in. But when we're dealing with the practice of historic preservation, it's really important to understand what are the different levels that are controlling. When we talk about the National Register of Historic Places and listing buildings on the register, we're not really talking about protecting those buildings in and of themselves. What we're doing is we're saying that these are resources that we think are important and need to be evaluated, particularly when federal funds are going to affect these historic districts or these buildings. And I think the standards have been so successful. They came out in 1978, and they really have stood the test of time. There are 10 standards that we will look at that are the Rehab Standards, which are the ones that are predominantly used, and they've been adopted by many states and local governments for overlay zones of review. So I think it's important to understand you know, what administrative bodies are going to look at your work, what the owner wants, what is the goal of the preservation plan, whether it's really to take something back in a period of time or move the building forward as a rehabilitated building. And I think that there's some cases, and I'll show a few in my opening slides, where there's some interesting design work going on and they may not meet the Secretary's standards. But in fact, I think those are decisions that an owner has to make in terms of what type of project is he working on. Is he doing something that's part of a historic district where you're trying to save the setting, or is it a building that can take a little more change even though it may not meet what we call the Secretary of the Interior standards? There are three principles that I think are important to remember in these standards as we go through, and that is that we're really trying to save historic materials, we're trying to save historic character of buildings, and we're trying to ensure that when additions are put onto buildings that they are somewhat reversible, that if you took them off you still had the integrity of the historic building. And if you can just remember those 3 points, I think that you will have a good start in being a practitioner in historic preservation. So let's turn the lights down, if we may. And I don't think I can do that from here. The Secretary of the Interior standards were developed, as I said, in 1978. It's interesting to note that they really were developed by HUD, so that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who were doing a lot of urban renewal and decimating a lot of historic buildings, and there was a sense that they really needed to have some guidelines. And the HUD guidelines were further developed into the Secretary of the Interior standards. So these are the standards that we'll be looking at today. We'll go through the 10 standards and then we'll look at some of the common rehab concerns we have. And I do have copies of the standards for those who would like to have them after the program. Now this is a building that I wanted to show you because it doesn't meet the Secretary of the Interior standards as written, but I think there are often some very dynamic and exciting projects, and when people want to know where's the design in urban centers and preservation projects, this jewel-like glass rooftop addition was added to an early Louis Sherry building, I believe in New York, and it's very dramatic in and of its own right. But as you learned in sort of Architecture 101, what you're looking at is how does a building meet the ground, how does a building turn the corner, and how does the building meet the skyline. So when you begin to get changes that affect those three sort of areas of basic architectural design, you're beginning to get into territory that doesn't follow meeting the Secretary's standards, because what we're trying to do is protect the resource as it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So this can be a very exciting design. And I think people have to recognize what an owner wishes. This is still America. This is not a historic district. It was just an individual building. It was not on the National Register. And I just bring to your attention that sometimes there are going to be projects. This is another one, and I'm sorry the top is just cut off, but it is a building in Washington, D.C. that had a replicative rooftop addition put on in 4 or 5 stories. And it's a very dramatic building. The envelope in this area is up to about 10 stories. It was a modest building. Unfortunately, it was part of a row that had some integrity. So while the rooftop addition is sort of exciting as an architectural design element and certainly adds height to this building and a greater return to the developer, it is not a project that would meet the Secretary's standards because it has a dramatic new element and it has changed the envelope of the building. We're also running into an awful lot of facade projects, which we find a little bit disturbing because I think it sort of cheapens historic preservation and it often makes for very poor design. In this case, however, the red line row of buildings I think is still much more interesting than the big box that was put behind it. So maybe in 20 years people will look back and say, well, this was sort of a facade project, but the old buildings were better than the new. But I am disturbed by how much facadism we seem to be having, and I think much of it is misplaced, and I would rather see good contemporary design than sort of a mix and match of pastiche of putting facades on buildings. So let's look at these secretary standards and see what they're all about. We used these standards for our tax rehabilitation program last year, $2.3 billion, and that's a B, billion dollars of private sector rehabilitation work was reviewed by my office and certified for tax credits. It was about 1,000 projects. Indiana had $25 million worth of that construction going on in 20 projects, and we have 27 Indiana projects in the pipeline. So it tends to be a program that is well known, well used, and people seem to understand where we're coming from in terms of saving historic fabric. The first standard is the use standard, and what it says is that you must find a compatible use for your building. The program cannot override what the building can take, and I think that this is a really important standard because you have to find the right building for the program you want to use. And whether the building is an existing building in retail that is going to stay in retail or whether it goes to a new use. This is a Vincennes, Indiana project that was a tax credit a number of years ago where an incompatible first floor change was removed and the storefronts were rebuilt, and it continued in a retail mode. So the use worked fine for this building. This is a project in Atlanta that was used, it was an old shoe factory. And after an almost $3 million rehabilitation, it is a facility for the mentally challenged. It's a single resident occupancy on the upper floors and large public spaces on the lower floors. It's gone from industrial use to institutional use, so the use has changed, but it has been compatibly done. The windows that had been bricked up were replaced with an industrial type window, and the large warehouse interior was subdivided. So we do allow for change of configuration as long as the character is retained, and this still has a very gutsy industrial character. And on the first floors, the large public spaces still have the support columns and the large windows. The second standard is the historic character standard, and it says to retain and preserve historic character in those material spaces and features that make a property significant. And this really goes hand in hand with standard number 1, because we don't want to take a building and strip it of its features. We want to enhance the feeling of the historic character of the resource. This is a project we were talking about at lunchtime. It's the Presidio of San Francisco. It's the old Letterman Hospital complex, where the hospital, it's now a decommissioned military facility, and a number of nonprofit organizations dealing with the environment, the Thoreau Center, are located in these buildings. And it's interesting that for the tax credits, nonprofit companies can partner with for-profit companies who can take advantage of the tax credit. Because if you're nonprofit, you're not paying any taxes. So there are a lot of syndications and partnerships that have developed. And in this property, the large hallways and ward rooms were retained with the insertion of office spaces. It's all environmentally sensitive. It's recycled materials. It's environmentally friendly. It's new woods that have been grown for the purpose of laminates and veneers. The large windows have been retained, and they've added in without subtracting or loss of historic character. They've even used in the large corridors filing systems and exhibits so that they can better utilize the space. The historic stairs have been retained, and they've used the California Building Code, which is much more sensitive to historic buildings, to seal off the staircases without having to do as strong a fire rating as there might be in other requirements. It's a heavily sprinklered building. And it doesn't eliminate the ability to put in secondary spaces new features. The third standard is the Don't Falsify History standard. And it says, don't falsify history by making a building appear older or grander than it is. And too often, particularly in towns where there's demolition going on. A well-meaning citizen wants to take a cupola from one building and put it on another, or take a porch from one building and put it on another, and it's important to recognize that buildings have to have their own style that they've come down through history with, and if it's a vernacular building, it should stay as a vernacular building. This is a poor little good twin, evil twin project, and the Victorian building has been sort of colonial revitalized. Whether they were trying to go back in history and make a colonial building, or whether they were going forward in history for colonial revival, it's hard to tell. But they have falsified the history of this building through those changes. The fourth standard is respect significant changes that have occurred over time. And this is a very hard standard to deal with, and really needs to be in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, because often buildings and historic districts are listed for a particular time frame. And for the historic districts that were listed in the 1970s and 1980s, many of them we think really need to be revisited. And many state historic preservation offices are going back and looking at historic districts and seeing if they shouldn't move the time frame to a more modern time, if there's still an integrity of resources that are a little more modern. This is a project in Providence, Rhode Island. It was a Victorian or even a little bit earlier building that had a deco front put on for Fane's department store, and is beloved by many. And that historic district doesn't come up to the 30s in terms of the period of time, but we would say that this is distinctive enough and has gained significance over time that if the building were to be rehabilitated, this change really ought to be documented and recognized as an extension of time. This is a project in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and it was a Victorian building that got changed during the period of significance of the historic district into a corner grocery store, and modifications were made for the corner entry. And this is the kind of change that really ought to be respected, because it speaks to the commercialization of a residential area with a lot of immigrant grocery stores that occurred. And when the house next door was bought, the grocery store was bought, and the owners decided, rightly so, to retain the historic character, and yet they wanted a little more privacy in the storefronts that are on the side. And so what they did was their architect developed a lattice screening, so it doesn't take away from the storefront. The storefront is still there, but it gives a sense of privacy for the home. So that falls under Standard 4. Standard 5 is the Preserve Historic Materials Standards, and we think that this is one of our key standards. To preserve distinctive materials, features, and craftsmanship and construction technology. This is very much tied to Standard 2, which is the materials standard. And it says that we should encourage the repair of craftsmanship and not to replace it. We have about 40% of our projects in the tax credit program are dealing with housing, and we're getting more and more projects dealing with affordable housing, and we have a critical issue with how to deal with lead-based paint. And in the past, many developers would go in and strip out all of the materials that give this area its historic character. So you look at the trim around the windows and the panels under the windows, and in the past, many times this would be stripped out, but with good chemical cleaning or good wet sanding, we can manage the lead-based paint. Even there are a number of encapsulant paints that are allowed to be used. This is the after of that same room, where they have replaced the window sash with matching sash because it is a friction surface, and they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to have any residual lead dust. But this is the kind of character that we see in our projects that's preserved, and that's part of what the tax credit is doing, is buying that retention of character. This is a similar project that did not meet the standards. This is the before condition, and not only do you have the same window trim, but notice the doorway with a transom over the doorway. The after project that did not meet the standards, everything was stripped out and just drywalled to casings. There's no trim work left. They've even changed out the door, lost the transom, and they've also put in a sort of a patio door going to a side garden. So this is sort of the type of project that we saw in a lot of the HUD projects, and it's still the type of project you'll see if the tax credits are not used, but the tax credits really are the carrot that make the retention of historic character. I think we lost a slide, but Standard 6 is the repair versus replace standard, and it says repair historic materials to the greatest extent possible. This is a core value of preservation. If you can repair, you should do so, and we have a lot of projects where somebody might decide to go in and just cover this with aluminum or vinyl siding. But we say, look at the materials, see what is deteriorated, and repair just what is deteriorated and keep it in the same form. As rehabilitations are undertaken, determine what is significant in there that really needs to be repaired. And here you have a stamped metal ceiling that we felt was very important. It was in poor condition, but the owners were able to repair and retain that stamped metal ceiling. And even though there's sort of contemporary low office in that area, it has been protected. We do allow the use of substitute materials in certain conditions, and this is a fiberglass canopy in Oak Park, Illinois. The steel canopy, the iron canopy was gone, but it was well documented, and for weight reasons it was replaced in a lighter weight material. So we are not averse to substitute materials when they can be well done, when it's documented what is being done, and particularly in areas where weight is a problem. Standard 7 is the cleaning standard. It says to clean as gently as possible, and if cleaning is needed, a gentle method such as a water wash should be used. We are very down on abrasives. We've always been against sandblasting, soft materials, brick and stone. This is a wall at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C., and it's in pretty good shape on one side, but somebody in the military decided that on the other side, which was on the post side, they needed to really do something to this wall. So they decided to clean it with sandblasting, and then they came back and used a slurry mix, taped off the bricks, and ran a slurry coat over it to tape in some construction joints. So this is happily not happening very often. Most people know that sandblasting can be very damaging, but we are beginning to get new products on the market, baking soda blasting, rubber pellet blasting. All of the abrasives really do damage, and it is very hard to control the operator. We have seen a couple of cases where we have allowed very selective use of very light abrasives in a very controlled, almost a museum type environment. And so we know it can be used, but on the commercial market, we really find that it does more damage. So we recommend that cleaning be done usually with water and very mild cleaning solutions, and that test patches be done prior to cleaning. And we also feel that buildings don't have to be spick and span clean. They just need to not have materials on them that are going to cause further erosion. Standard 8 is the archaeology standard, and this is used a lot in federal programs where there's grant money that's being given, and archaeology is part of the scope of the work. What we find in the tax credit program, however, is that we rarely invoke this standard because it's generally small additions that are being undertaken. There's not archaeological excavation of the site, but what we do encourage owners to do is if they find archaeological evidence when they're doing some kind of excavation, that they are in touch with the State Historic Preservation Office to see if there can be some assistance with mitigation or documentation. Standards 9 and Standards 10 are the new edition standards. And Standard 9 is sort of the differentiate new construction standard. And what it says is, for new additions, they should be of a size, scale, and massing that don't overwhelm the historic resource, and that additions should be differentiated as new construction. This is in outside of Atlanta. It was a mansion house that had been derelict and abandoned for some time, and it was converted into a bank, executive office for a bank with a drive-in teller and a vault area. Now, it would have been very easy for them to just put a big addition on this building, to take the front yard and turn it into a parking area, but they were very concerned because it was a residential, on the edge of a residential area, and it really was a grand mansion house, that they protect that historic character. So they did so with a very careful restoration. The building was just having been sealed up for some time, was in poor condition, but everything was there, and it was all good quality material, and it was salvageable. You will just see peeking off to the right the new addition that was put on, and they used the site very sensitively. The back had over time lost its back porch, and so we do not require that things that are lost be reconstructed. You can leave something the way it is. And this was the perfect area to put a small glass box hyphen connector and a fairly contemporary addition stepping down as the hill goes to the back. And this is not highly visible from the front, but it made wonderful sense for the drive-in bank, the vault, and the offices in the front. So we think that this is a very successful project. And the addition size and scale and massing is very much compatible with the large historic building. We do allow somewhat large additions on buildings, but it's such an individual call. You have to really look at the setting of a building. Is it a jewel-like building on a large landscape, or is it a building in an urban context where compatible new additions and infill construction can be done? This was not a tax credit project, but it was a very successful project for the Folger Library in Washington, and to the rear a fairly large addition was put on, but it's in an area where there are a lot of large public buildings. The site to the back was not particularly significant. It was a parking area. But once an addition begins to be about the same size as the main building, we get an effect of sort of the tail wagging the dog. So we are pretty conservative in the size, scale, and massing of new additions. Standard 10 is the reversibility standard, and this is kind of an intellectual exercise because when people build additions, they're generally not thinking of removing them in the future. They've spent a lot of money designing them. So what we ask is, as with the bank building, and 9 and 10 usually go hand in hand, is that the new addition not sort of blind a whole back of a building and take the back wall out of a building and just blend it together, but that this is a school that was converted into senior housing, and they needed new elevators and new circulation and entrance areas, and so pavilions were added to the school building. It doesn't take away from the scale and massing, and if you took that element off, you still would have the integrity of the historic resource. This is a project that was a residence that was doubled in size. It's a very narrow residence, and in fact, they just duplicated the size. So it misses on the reversibility issue, and it misses on the clearly new addition. If you look at this building, the front, on the side elevation, the front 2 windows are what were the historic building, and the last 2 bays of windows are the addition. It's all blended. You have no idea what the original resource is. You don't know what came down through on the National Register. And I did ask for a pointer so I could show you where the, this is the demising line between the historic building and the addition. And you'll notice that all of the trim and details is historicized, And in fact, if they had wanted to do an addition, they should have ended the building here and had some kind of setback addition that would show that that building was evolving through time. And I think it's very important in these new addition standards to remember what it is that we are trying to protect and preserve. It's what has come down to us through the National Register. We are not trying to freeze buildings in time, but we're trying to protect the integrity of those resources as they were historically, allowing new additions to occur. And I think we have to look at what are we going to put on the National Register in 50 years from now, or what are kind of the new resources that we're going to be dealing with. And I think it's important not to have replicative things like this where you confuse what is historic and what is new. I just wanted to go through a few administrative things. We are looking at applying the standards as reasonably as possible. I think it's an interesting statistic that of our tax credit projects that come to us through the State Historic Preservation Office with a full application, about 97% of them are certified. Some have additional conditions on them, but almost every project that comes through the door goes out the door with a certification. And so these standards, we feel, are applied reasonably. We look at economic and technical feasibility, and people often get confused by that because they think, as in the example of where the trim work was taken off the windows, if it's too expensive to do it, I don't have to do it. It's economically not feasible. But that's not what we're talking about when we're saying we're applying these standards in a reasonable way for economic and technical feasibility. What we're saying is that we are looking at the condition of the building and whether or not it can sustain some modification or changes, whether the plaster needs to be replaced as plaster, or if it's so deteriorated that it can be replaced with drywall. These are the kind of issues we're talking about, because you still have to meet all 10 standards if you go through our program of tax rehabilitation. And these are still the same standards that are looked at when state preservation officers are looking at grant programs. This is an aftershot of a school in Baltimore. We have an awful lot of redundant schools in this country. As new schools are being built, old schools are being left behind. Many of them are in urban areas that are don't have many children or are getting revitalized. So we're finding a lot of schools going to housing, particularly senior housing. It's a very successful conversion. Economically, it's not really feasible to keep this classroom as an open space. So we certainly have allowed the subdivision of classrooms. We do keep wide corridors as wide corridors because that is a character-defining feature of a school building. But for the classrooms, often they're 400 or 600 square feet, and it's a perfect size for conversion to a one-bedroom or unit or an efficiency unit or whatever. And so this is that same classroom that has been subdivided. But you'll notice that they've kept high ceilings. They have retrofitted the historic windows. They put interior window sash on. They actually they rebuilt the windows in a way that have a 5-pound lift so that they can the elderly can still lift these very large windows. The areas closest to the corridor have a drop ceiling with the mechanical systems in the plenum above, kitchens and bathrooms. They kept the historic wooden floors. And in historic school conversions, we do require that one of the major public spaces, usually the auditorium or the gymnasium building, be retained, because that's really character defining for these buildings as they were historically. And the auditoriums generally work very well for communal dining or community spaces. And in this particular case, the balcony was, the existing balcony that was here was extended with a catwalk balcony. Even though it crosses over the historic windows, the catwalk balcony goes to another exit and to a modern elevator core that is part of the new work of this building. So we do take economic and technical feasibility into account, but projects still have to meet the standards. The other thing is that we do look at exteriors and interiors, and many historic district review commissions only look at exteriors. They use the standards for the exteriors. But we feel that so much of the historic character is on the interior, and because these are buildings that are commercial buildings, the public does come in and the public does see them. So if there's still a historic interior, we want to see a hierarchy of retention for the most significant spaces retained pretty much as is, and less significant spaces can have the alterations and changes that are needed. In looking at exteriors, we also look at how the parking comes, and if you'll think back to the bank that put all its parking in the back, this is a mansion house that was converted into a restaurant. It was one of our denied projects. Not only did the parking take up the whole side of the building, but this is the historic building right back in here. All of these are additions that were added. They wrapped around the building, and the poor little front porch got sort of stained glass window all around it. So we are looking at the impact on landscapes and historic settings. We are economically neutral. We do high-end projects. We do low-end projects. We've been very lucky that Treasury has allowed us to not cap this program. Anybody who applies who has a historic building who is going to convert it can take 20% on whatever the eligible expenses are. It's not limited to, $50 a square foot or $125 a square foot. It's whatever it takes to bring this building back. And these are small shotguns that are in Georgia, and they had sort of tar paper siding covering the wood siding, and the porches were deteriorated. And for a very small amount of money, these buildings were rehabilitated so that the same tenants who were in them could continue to live in them. So we're not always, a gentrification kind of a program, and we welcome and encourage this. And we do partner our historic tax credit program with the low-income housing tax credit program, and that has been a very successful combination to keep the historic character of these buildings when they're in historic districts. We also do high-end projects. This is the Union Station in Washington, D.C., which in the mid-'80s had about $130 million rehabilitation undertaken on it, and it was after the Park Service had done some very unpleasant and disastrous things to this building to be a visitor center for the bicentennial. In fact, they had cut into the floor a large sort of early idea of an IMAX theater. It was 80 television screens that showed a continuous slideshow of the bicentennial for Washington. You went down into the pit and then sort of came back up. So the Park Service can't always say that it is the one that always does preservation. Sometimes we need to be reminded that we have a mission. And so the Union Station was rehabilitated. It was kept as a train station, but also commercial shops were incorporated into the concourse. And the review issue on this one was that they wanted to have another floor level in here of shops, and we said no. What is significant about the concourse is the coffered ceiling, and although we allowed them to excavate and go down into the basement area and open it up, we felt that this was a character-defining feature that had to be retained. Some of the common rehab concerns, we'll go through this very quickly because I'm coming up on my time and I want to have you have a chance for some questions. Some of the common rehab concerns we have with our program is there is a whole sort of theme going through historic buildings now to deconstruct them. And a lot of commercial ventures want to take the New York Soho kind of raw, gutsy approach to warehouse buildings and put it into any building that happens to be around. And this used to be a hotel building that had finished spaces and plaster on the columns, and it's very hard to see it, but the columns have been stripped of their finishes, and it is the steel girders with the heads of the bolts that are exposed, and it's very gutsy, and it's fine in a warehouse building, but it's not fine in a finished historic interior. So what we're finding is this trend of, it sort of goes back to the bare brick that we saw in the 80s. We're having a lot of deconstructed interiors, and this is not something that we accept as meeting the standards, because you have to go back to what was the significance of the resource and how did it come through history. We also have this sort of approach to, well, let's let it all hang out, and here's the mechanical systems that are just sort of free-floating in a finished corridor area. So, and this is how we think differently from a lot of design architects or mechanical engineers who are used to doing a different kind of a project. We're also running into a situation where, with urban land being so expensive, people want to increase the size of their buildings with rooftop additions. And this is a problem. It doesn't, if we go back to that early design standard of, or the design principle of how does a building meet the sky, historically this building had a large projecting cornice, and that was how it terminated. So putting these sort of mansarded type modern additions, our feeling is if that is what the city is willing to permit, and it's been through its own historic district review, that is something that we don't stop happening, but we don't give tax credits to do it. And in this case, the owners must have penciled it out and figured it was better to have the square footage than to have the tax credits. Another problem we're finding is this is a model of a series of historic buildings, and sometimes there's just too much money out there, and this is all new construction in rooftop additions that were proposed, and it came in as a preliminary review, and we said no, this was not a program that met our criteria. And so I'm not sure if it is a project that fell by the wayside or if it was going to be done without the tax credits. We're also finding a problem with developers wanting to change the character of the building. And if we look back on the early standards that say, accept the character of the building the way it is and work with it. This is an industrial building that was developed into a high-end showroom for furnishings. And this is the after of that same building. And although we can accept some changes in buildings, there really has lost, you don't, I mean, this, you could be in a big box small building somewhere, and this would be the interior. It's full of Doric columns and it's very elegant, but it has nothing to do with the historic character of that building. We're also continuing to have problems with windows. Any of you who've read our literature know that we are very serious about windows. Windows are perhaps the most character-defining feature of a building. It's the visual interface between the interior and the exterior. Historic windows, we tend to feel, are often better constructed, but we get a lot of the energy arguments for having thermal glass, the ease of sort of a tilt-in vinyl window, easy cleaning. And so we do not accept these kinds of windows because they don't match the size and detailing of the historic windows. You would not have a historic window with a flat mutton bar on it. We, on residential projects, expect if the windows are deteriorated that a look-alike wooden window will be allowed. In some cases, we have allowed aluminum baked enamel, finish aluminum on upper areas of high-rise buildings above the sort of classical base of a building. We also continue to run into problems where people want to do a contemporary rendition of the building and take the windows out and put tinted butt glass in the window, and this doesn't meet our criteria either. For industrial steel sash, very large industrial steel sash, we have worked with a number of manufacturers to develop an integral grid pattern in an aluminum window with thermal glass in between, and the grids on the interior and the exterior and spacer bars between them. And that has proved to be successful when steel sash have not been able to be retained. But we also find that some of the original steel sash manufacturers are still fabricating. So there are more window choices than there were even 10 years ago, and I think that's a tribute to the Park Service's standards being so strong on windows that the manufacturers have retooled so that people can meet our standards. Sometimes, and this is my last slide, set of slides, sometimes you can find a real jewel in doing a rehabilitation project, because the building has been through a 1950s remodeling, and even the colors seem to be somewhat reminiscent of maybe the 60s with the burnt orange. And although we don't like people to go in and fabricate a historic interior that has been lost over time, in this case, all of the elegance of the building was behind this sort of wood paneling. And this is what the developers had when they started. They knew that there were good finishes behind, and they brought them all back. And I think that sometimes you can really find a treasure in these projects. So I thank you very much for this, and we'll have some questions if I'll put the lights up. Well, I turned everything off, so I don't know if it'll come back on or not. There. Some of you have asked about what are the opportunities in historic preservation. We can talk about that. We can talk about some of the projects that have come through. We can talk about what you might be interested in terms of your own careers, or what you see happening in Indiana or your own hometowns, or we can look at a few more slides. But I know it's late in the afternoon, so I don't know how energized you all are. Yes.
In a historic district where lots of traffic is justified, is hearing association
That's a very good question, because we've seen it particularly in Charleston. The question is, how can you use the argument of feeling and association to stop all of the traffic that goes through historic districts? There's some, in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and other places, every weekend is flea market weekend and craft weekend, and you just get thousands of people coming. And I think it's not so much the people coming as it is the traffic that it brings, and then the subsequent parking, or the slowing down as people are trying to look for a parking place. One of the success stories is Charleston, but it's also one of the tragedies, and that is that the reason Charleston is so successful is that they developed a whole series of internal parking lots in alleyways, and they have a lot of public parking, but it came at the expense of extensive demolition. So you have to sort of, today we think it's just wonderful because they have some compatible new construction, they have all this parking garages, but they also have a very strong mayor who has said, don't ever take a corner building down. If you have to lose something, lose a tooth in the smile, but don't lose the corners. And I think those are some of the important kind of planning guidelines to sort of keeping the integrity of a block. We've been having a dilemma in Cape May, New Jersey, National Historic Landmark District. There's not enough parking. Parking is occurring on the lawn of one of the Grand Lady hotels, and it's been grandfathered in as part of the rehabilitation work because they're not doing anything to the site, and the city keeps giving a permit for the owner to park cars on the lawn. But after a certain amount of time, that lawn's going to be gone. So, you know, that's a real problem. That community needs to develop some kind of transportation system that will take satellite parking and come in on some sort of public transportation or city trams to bring the people in, because the merchants want the income from the tourists. They don't want to discourage the tourists, but parking is a real problem. I think you can use the argument of a feeling as an association as much as you want, but if you don't provide an alternative somewhere, it won't hold up. But that's a good question. I think they're tired. It's been a long day for you, I know. So.
More
Well, I have a second slide tray with just about 10 or 12 slides in it because I thought you might be interested in some of the initiatives and opportunities we see as to where historic preservation is going. So if we just take another 10 minutes, I'll show you a couple of slides. I think we have to take the first carousel light off up there. If you could turn that one off. Great. Thank you. When somebody asked where is the design in historic rehabilitations, and I said I thought it was a real challenge, I do really believe that it's one of the greatest challenges because you're not starting with a clean slate, and particularly in some of these industrial buildings where we need to integrate the new uses. And this is sort of an office use that still keeps the historic character of this building as it has been remodeled. And I think that really good design that's taking clean and simple lines and working, this is the conference room that's behind a glass area. It still keeps the heavy timbers, separates an open plan office area from closed off areas for some sound and privacy. This is an architect's office that is integrated well into a historic building. We have big buildings that need to be rehabilitated. There's also a challenge in the smaller buildings of keeping the historic character. This is a series of 30 buildings in a historic district outside of Pittsburgh, near Carnegie Mellon. It was where Martha Graham, the dancer, grew up. And 30 buildings were converted, 20 buildings were converted into 30 housing units for low and moderate income housing. And it's really been a challenge to take interiors that look like this and bring them back to something that looks like this. And I think that communities are doing a lot to foster this sense of pride of place. We've had lots of controversies as to whether we should dumb down the standards for sort of a very low-income area. And interestingly enough, low-income areas say, well, why should the projects across the road have hardwood floors and nice banister railings and a good mantel and a fireplace, and we get a vinyl floor and drywall and kind of not much character? And so I think it's important to stop and think, what is it that we're trying to preserve? And I think everyone should have a sense that their historic building has come down to them in a condition that they are proud to maintain and take care of. We also have a new initiative in terms of the recent past, which might be of interest. We have newer resources that are coming onto the National Register. We have real concern that these be taken care of and that they not be demolished as strip areas and others change. A lot of interesting neon and lights go with these kind of, whoa, that one went out of focus. I don't know that I can. They're dynamic at nighttime as well as during the day, and the National Park Service and the Association of Preservation Technology are co-sponsoring in October in Philadelphia the Preserving the Recent Past 2 conference, which is looking at buildings from the 1920s to the 1960s and how are we going to protect many of these very fragile resources. Also, I think there's a challenge in new design in terms of taking historic buildings, that this is a power plant that had been burned out and it was turned into 6 apartments. This is the power plant. And by keeping the same exterior, behind the parapet wall at the top, skylights were added, and a very interesting floor arrangement was developed. A floor level was put across here, remembering that the whole power plant had burned out. And to meet exiting codes, the architects detailed this window area to be hinged and to open up and form a balcony on which you could then come down if you were in an emergency. And I think that that kind of clever thinking and how can you meet codes in a different and unusual way is a design issue. This is the balcony that was added. This is the railing that is hinged and comes down, and then the window opens out from there. So this is where I think that good design can really make an impact on historic buildings. We also have the challenge of historic restorations. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's home and studio in Oak Park, Illinois. And what are we going to do with these projects when we want to add a climate control system because it is a museum environment? I've done a lot of research on new climate control systems in historic buildings. I feel that it's best not to add a climate control system which introduces moisture into a building in the form of humidity. And I think if you can avoid doing those kinds of systems, you're best off for the historic building. But in some cases, museum environments really do require it. So how can you integrate these systems without destroying really, really significant historic fabric? And in this case, a lot of HVAC was put behind cabinets, and they're fed from these plenums come from down in the basement area, and the chillers are outside, the condensers are outside, and even to the point where supply registers are up in between the battens in the ceiling. So the people that I feel need the greatest education are the mechanical engineers. They still very much have their standard systems and their sheet work, duct work, and everything has to be in a certain way. And I think education of historic preservation is going along pretty well with the architects. It's getting better with the engineers, but the structural engineers, but the mechanical engineers, I find are really needing to think in a different mindset, just the way I think a preservationist thinks in a different mindset. Also, there's some exciting projects that deal with the conservation of materials and craft technologies. This is the New Amsterdam Theater in New York City that the Disney Studios restored for their Lion King and Beauty and the Beast productions, as it was a tax credit project. This was the condition of the building before they started, and one might imagine that Disney would bring in the Disney Imagineering team and do this either in some kind of virtual reality or some kind of fiberglass composite material, but they didn't. They really went and found the best of the craftsmen and redid all of the plaster. Let's see if I can go back. Redid all of the plaster and the decorative work in the traditional manner, and I think they're to be commended for it. And of course the tax credits were involved, so for every dollar there was 20 cents that they could save. There's also a big challenge with how do we integrate accessibility into historic buildings, and to have details that work well with the historic buildings, even if the pickets aren't 4 inches apart. I think that we have to really educate our code officials that sometimes we can have details that don't meet exactly their design guidelines but work best with the buildings. And I think we need to continue working on how do we conserve historic materials, how do we use the technology to identify materials and deterioration, how do we handle moisture meters and problems of that kind, how do we do radar sensing. There's a lot of technology that we can use in historic preservation, and it takes almost a new generation of students and practitioners to develop those new technologies because so many of them are computer driven. We need to continue to remind ourselves that there are no Band-Aid solutions, that we cannot just put a waterproof coating on a building and expect that it's going to stay dry. In fact, these kinds of coatings often further deterioration. So I think for those interested in preservation technology, there is a real open field there to understand materials and new materials and whether they work or they don't work. This is the restoration of a metal cornice. And this is my final slide. It's really on the standards and guidelines. Well, it's not my final, but it's almost my final. We have a whole series of technical publications that we have developed in the Park Service. I think we've been fairly unique in developing a lot of this information and having conferences because we've been charged that that's our mission to do it. We need to educate the public, and even though we administer a tax credit program, we really consider ourselves educators. What we are doing is trying to get the message out as to what is historic preservation, why do we do it, and how can we do it effectively and efficiently, and we do it through a lot of these conferences that build the basis of material. I know many of you use this material in your training, and I hope that you will help us as you go through your careers and stay in preservation and develop some of this material that can be used by others. Thank you very much. I think they're free to go.
Thank you very much.